Alright, so ignoring the fact that 18% of you think that I'm a bot, it does appear that 35% of you want me to actually make a build out of some of the worst things in the game. Okay, challenge accepted, let's see what we can do. Now the first thing we gotta do is figure out what is the worst. I mean, we all play the game, we all have our different opinions on what we use, what we like, what we don't like, what we just never touch, never use. And that is a huge opinion-based thing in the game, right? I mean, for a person who's predominantly a skill build and never touches DPS stuff, a lot of those DPS things might be completely useless. A lot of the weaker DPS talents might just be the worst things in the game. And of course, for a DPS build, skill stuff just is meaningless. So, we have to kind of factor out those different, choices, those different preferences, and actually determine what is great, what is bad, what is used, what isn't used. What I've ended up doing was trying to, just look at what people are using currently, look at a lot of the builds that I've basically made in the past, look at, what players are using in Skirmish, look at what players are using in the DZ, and of course just kind of combine all of this stuff and try to figure out some sort of common ground, right? Now, I've basically just made a basic outline of what I wanted to consider. All right, so nothing that would be considered meta was going to be in the build, right? It's not going to be on most players, and it's not going to be normally featured in build videos, mine or anyone else really on YouTube. For the most part, these things are going to be considered fairly weak. If I inspect random players in the safe houses, I'm not going to see this stuff, right? And also I wanted to avoid combinations that kind of might be weak on their own but kind of work well together. Now moving into what I think are more important metrics. If you look at the DZ, right? If the DZ is dead, is it because it is a crappy targeted loot? There's some loot there that players just will not go for. And another thing is, do I actually need to farm for this loot? Like if I don't have it in my stash, then it's probably terrible. However, this is very important. At the end of the day, it needs to be an actual build. This isn't just, stacking on spotter with no way of actually proccing it and saying, oh, this is the worst build ever. No, this is an actual build that I'm trying to make using things that people generally disregard completely. So what I did to help determine this was basically, by worst, I mean pretty much the least used. So I mean, if players aren't using it, it's got to be bad, or at least it has to be a general consensus that there is no use for this type of equipment or this type of talent or this type of gear. So what I did was I looked at various tables that listed all of the gear, all the talents, and stuff like that. And I basically just started crossing off things that I would use, that I knew I liked, that I know I've seen, other players make build videos on, or that I've made build videos on, or stuff that I've basically discussed, the most common items. And basically what I wanted to try to do was remove 50% of everything. So I wanted to remove 50% of the weapons, 50% of the armor, 50% of the brand sets, 50% of the talents. Just remove as much as possible and basically be left with the bottom 50% of things that players use. And for the most part, the bottom 50% generally turns out to be used by very few people. I mean, less than, like 10% of people probably use the bottom 50% of this gear. Now, to basically show you what I mean, I'm using this table from Cooks, and we can pretty much see all the brand sets listed. Now, this one does not include Bellstone, but, that will be accounted for. So, I mean, you've got, the most popular ones and some of the, the lackluster ones. Well, if you take, the DPS ones, the most popular DPS ones out of the equation, you do remove a very significant part. I mean, Fenris, Cheska, Grupo, all of the major ones, remove them, get those out of the way. Then, of course, take out the most popular armor-related brand sets. Gila, Golan, Bellstone. Get rid of them. Now, of course, moving into just different skill gear. Obviously, Hanayu, Wyvern, gone. Now, like I said, I wasn't going to include metagear. So any of the named perfect pieces, like the Petrov Contractor's Gloves or the Fox's Per knee pads, obviously, I don't consider those to be part of the brand sets, right? Those are just meta pieces, so those are not considered. Now, of course, when you look at the talents, I mean, there's plenty of talents to choose from. But when you start cutting away a lot of the used pieces, a lot of the used choices, again, you're left with about half that most players just don't touch for one reason or another. Now, some of them may be useful. You may see them, as part of some occasional builds. But by and large, they are the least popular ones. And the same thing with the backpack talents. Obviously, there are, again, plenty of options, some that are really good. But when you start cutting away the ones that people really use, the ones that you actually see in use on a regular basis, again, you're left with about 50% of them. I mean, this just kind of shows you that half of the stuff in the game is generally junk. And while some of them may be popular with a team build like Opportunistic, by itself, it's generally underpowered. It's very weak. It's built around the idea of using it as part of a team. Now, when it comes to the specialization, I think it's really difficult to decide which one is the worst or the least used. So, I mean, we all know that Firewall, Demolitionist, Gunner, the Technician, those are some of the most used specializations. Of course, that kind of leaves Survivalist and Sharpshooter kind of just, by the wayside. Now, they're not bad. I mean, they all have their uses, right? I mean, if you're going with a sniper build, yeah, you're going to use the Sharpshooter for the most part. If you're going for a support build, yeah, you might want to use the Survivalist. But I mean, generally speaking, the Survivalist and the Sharpshooter probably are going to be, some of the specializations that you do see the least. But for this build specifically, I'm going to choose the Survivalist specialization just because I think it offers the most synergy for the build that I'm going to choose. Now, like I said, this is going to be an actual usable build, so I don't just want to pick random junk just to make it as terrible as possible just for the sake of making it terrible. Again, I want things to be cohesive, to function, to be an actual build, right? That's important. Now, the one thing I do want to say before I, actually get into the build itself was I did test out some things and I was kind of surprised by this. I tested out the 2 healing skills that I'll be using, and that was the Mender Seeker and the Fixer Drone. Now, if you actually look at the stats on these skills, they do list healing per second as relatively the exact same amount. Now, of course, depending on which mods you're using, they might be different. But what I ended up finding was that the healing rate for them is drastically different. The Mender Seeker heals about half as fast as the Fixer Drone. So if you are using these skills, this is a reason why you might choose one over another. I mean, the Mender Seeker, definitely good for, team play, definitely good for helping your allies. But if you're going for a self-heal, yeah, you're really going to want the drone. All right, so jumping into the actual build, I don't think it'll come as a surprise to anyone that I chose for my main weapon the M16. Yes, that burst fire rifle that no one touches. I don't think I can get anyone to disagree that this is probably one of the worst, if not the worst, weapons in the game. It has never had a use. It has never really had any sort of build dedicated to using it. Doesn't really have anything that sets it apart as being good. It is just generally a crappy weapon. Now, for my second weapon, I decided to go with the military L86. Now, it's not really a bad weapon, but to be honest, after the M16, there's really not a terrible weapon. When it comes to the magazine-fed LMGs, very rarely do you ever see anybody using them. And I think I've seen one player using an RPK, and I think it was the named version. But the L86, I don't think I've ever actually seen someone using it. And the main reason probably for this is because it kind of fits into this very gray category of it wants to be an AR, but it's an LMG category. So it has terrible accuracy, terrible stability, the reticle pattern is terrible, and the reload is incredibly long for a magazine. I mean, I think it's 2.7 seconds. Then when you add the extended mag, the plus 20 rounds, I think it's like 3 seconds. It pretty much just combines all of the bad things of an AR and all of the bad things of an LMG and just combines them into one just kind of lackluster weapon. So for that reason, I chose the L86. Now, of course, for the sidearm, it's not really that important, obviously, but I think for the most part, the 93R is probably considered one of the worst sidearms in the game. So I think it was a no-brainer that I went with that. Now, looking at my mask, you can see I've got armor, repair skill, crit chance, and I've got an incoming repair mod. My backpack, armor, crit chance, crit damage, incoming repair, and I've decided to use companion. Now, obviously, this one gives me, increased total weapon damage whenever I'm, within 5 meters of an ally or a skill. It's not a terrible talent, but when you consider what it's up against normally, yeah, there's a reason players don't normally choose it. Moving into my gloves, you can see here I'm using the Richter Kaiser with 6% crit chance, and I've got crit hit damage on there. My chest piece is a Richter Kaiser, skill tier, crit hit damage, crit hit chance, and incoming repair mod. I've got entrenched on there. So this kind of feeds a little bit into the, the repair aspect of this build. And, that's definitely a talent that you just don't see very often. I mean, I can't remember the last time I've actually seen somebody using it. My holster is actually going to be an Alps. Now, I've basically chose this because, again, this is supposed to be a working build, and this just kind of rounds off what I'm trying to do with this build. Now it's got weapon damage, armor regeneration, and crit hit chance on there. And then finally, moving into my knee pads, my last piece of Richter Kaiser, I've got it rolled in weapon damage. It has repair skill and crit hit damage. Now moving into my skills, using that Mender Seeker, you can see here my healing is at 50k per second, and then my fixer drone again is hitting 47k per second. Now you can kind of see where I'm going with this, trying to make a self-healing rainbow build with at least somewhat decent DPS. So in total I have 11 reds, I've got 6 blues and 4 yellows. Now some people may agree or disagree with whether this is actually the worst things that you can possibly put on a build. I mean, there are other options, sure. But again, this is supposed to be a good faith build. I'm not trying to, intentionally jinx the build by putting on Spotter with no way of actually activating Spotter. I'm not trying to, use skill talents on a DPS build. But I'm also not just trying to convert bad brand sets into, just full skill builds with max skill damage and then just rock, like the assault turret and the striker drone and kind of cheese dick it, I'm trying to actually make this a good build with, some of the least used stuff. And in that aspect, I think I've actually pretty much accomplished this pretty well. Now, early on when I wanted to, figure out this build, I knew that Richter and Kaiser and 511 were generally two of the worst brand sets and two of the least used brand sets. I mean, health, explosive resistance, incoming repair, generally not favored, generally not used by pretty much anyone. However, if you've actually been watching my channel for a while, you do know that I did put out a video basically talking about heal stacking. But once I pretty much identified the two worst brand sets, I knew that incoming repair was pretty much the most positive way to really go. I mean, there's really no other way around it. So I needed to incorporate what those brand sets offered and try to make a build around it. Now, of course, when you combine repair skills, when you combine a little bit of skill tier, when you combine that incoming repair, you get those multiplicative healing bonuses. So when I use those healing skills, I'm just getting a lot more healing than I normally would. And a lot more healing than, pretty much any DPS build would. I mean, you would have to really spec into a lot of skill repair, a lot of, skill tier to match this healing. And because of that, you would have to sacrifice a lot of DPS. So just from that aspect alone, this build definitely works wonders as a self-healing build. However, just because of the weapon choice alone, the damage is just kind of pathetic. Now, I don't normally like LMGs, I don't normally like rifles that much, especially these specific ones. So I really did the best I could. However, I think this build actually could be really good if you didn't, follow what I did. If you change the talents to use good talents, if you change the weapons to use good weapons, this build could be really, really strong. Just changing the chest piece to kinetic momentum, just getting, the M1A and maybe the AK, you could definitely be putting out a lot more damage. You could definitely be a lot more accurate, a lot more aggressive with your build. I mean, you could do some decent things with this build and actually make it usable. That's all up to you, but I think this build kind of proves that incoming repair skill, and a little bit of skill tier definitely has something to offer. And I mean, I know a lot of players aren't using this type of build, and I mean, obviously there's a reason for it. This mission specifically took me probably about 3 times longer than it would with one of my more optimized, more, deadly builds. But either way, I think it was a fun little experiment just to see, what you can do with some bad gear. Thank you guys for watching. I'll see you in the next one.